He is sometimes referred to as Toronto's tiny perfect mayor. David Crombie wore the chain of office from 1972 to 1978, critical growth years that helped remake Hogtown into an aspiring world-class city. Amongst his many accomplishments, he's an officer of the Order of Canada and a member of the Order of Ontario. Plus, he even made the cover of Time magazine. And Mr. Crombie joins us tonight to understand the glory days of city building. Welcome. It's a pleasure to meet you.
My pleasure.
We were supposed to be on a panel last year.
Hot docs.
And then we were communicating on email, so it's nice to meet you in person.
It absolutely is.
And how can I how can I address you? Your worship, Mr.
David would be good.
David is good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you were mayor of Toronto 1972 to 1978,
Yes.
3 terms.
Yes.
And you came to politics because of a concern for the city's development. What had you worried back then?
Well, this was the 60s. I was actually elected to council for the first time in 69. In the early days, there were 3-year terms, then 2-year terms. Now they're 4-year terms. And in the 60s, we had a reaction. My generation had a reaction to the Toronto that we saw emerging, and that Toronto that we saw emerging in the late 40s and 50s and 60s had tremendous benefits of equality of opportunity, building houses in the suburbs. People were feeling and wanting to have both equality of opportunity and security, and they were, by and large, many people were getting it. But part of that package was what was known as the American model of city building at the time, and it involved things like expressways into the core, because the notion was we should have a separation of uses in our cities. So we should live here, play there, work here, and use a car.
Commute.
All of that. That was the notion. And along with the notion of more expressways, there was also the notion that we should have what they called urban renewal in those days. And urban renewal in those days meant you cleaned out the slums, as they called them, and built new. And from our point of view, what it was doing was we were in danger of hollowing out the downtown, which was happening in American cities, that they were having expressways into the core that were absolutely lacerating those cities. So ours was a reaction to say, no, we want to hold back on the expressways coming into the core. We also want to make sure that we're bringing a mix of uses, therefore we want a new downtown plan. And we also want affordable housing.
Which is an issue that we're still talking about.
For sure. And as later we may talk about, the issues endure, and each generation has to try and fix it their way. So our reaction was that. It was known as the Reform Movement, and that Reform Movement began the notion of building Toronto by Toronto identifying not the British way, not necessarily the American way, but its own way.
Was there a plan, like a specific plan, like a vision in mind, or did it just, happen organically?
People throughout the 60s, from about 1964-5 on, with the new City Hall in 1964, there was a sense that we could begin to remake the city or rechannel the city into the ways that I just mentioned. That was also helped by tremendous immigration. We were not only new baby boomers, expanding the population, but tremendous immigration from the United States because of the Vietnam War, from Anglo-Quebecers because of the Quiet Revolution, and from all other parts of the world. And that mix meant we had lots of energy, lots of imagination about what was possible. And so from our point of view, we began then to say, what is Toronto? What's its soul about? What kind of place is it? And we therefore took an interest in our own history. And throughout the late 40s and 50s, when everybody wanted new, and early 60s, they were destroying some of the built heritage that we had.
Well, that's what I wanted to actually talk about. Let's go back a few decades.
Sure.
Post-war World II. What was Toronto like then?
The post-World War II, it was a quiet place. It was a very contained place. One of the things that came after the war and in the 50s and 60s and 70s was an attempt to redesign, re-understand what social life should be about. After the war, before the war, and just after the war, in 1945, social life in Toronto was fairly, how do I call it, really quiet. Really quiet. In fact, they used to have that joke, that the first prize. The first prize is 1 week in Toronto. The second prize is 2 weeks in Toronto. It was if you were from Montreal, you just sort of laughed at Toronto. So it was a very quiet place. Now, I was raised at that time, so there were lots of hidden pleasures that Torontonians of that age will have that I have. But there's no doubt that by any standard of a larger, vibrant city, Toronto was becoming one. It wasn't one yet in 1945.
Do you think there was this idea like of how great city it could be?
By 1945, when the war was over, I went back and did some research for other reasons later on. There was this tremendous plan in 1943 of what the city could look like, not only the city itself, but the region around it. I used a 1943 planning map of the city of Toronto later on when we were talking about the Oak Ridges Moraine, because it was part of the regional map of Toronto as understood in those days. The Planning Act was established in 1946. There was a tremendous need to want to make it work, make it bigger, because you had a generation of the Depression and the war who were looking for what was new, equality of opportunity, security, and out of it came, along with that, the consumer revolution. So that more and more people wanted more stuff.
And one of those things was the car. Automobiles were king back then.
The automobile was king back then.
How did that affect city planning?
Well, it affected city planning because, as I mentioned, the American model was that's okay. Bring in those expressways because it's separation of uses. If you want to go from your work to where you live, to where you worked, to where you played, you use your car. We needed to not get rid of that, but to constrain that. And so part of our notion at that time, not everybody's, but certainly the people who brought in the reform movement in Toronto, our interest was in trying to restrain the automobile to make sure that we were using it appropriately, not just running amok with the automobile. I used to say, for example, my little slogan was, yes, you've got a right to come downtown. Everybody's got a right to come downtown, but you don't necessarily have a right to have take 2,000 pounds of steel with you everywhere you want to go, right? So it was how do we deal with the automobile and not just let it deal with us?
Right. And so, but did the original transit planners back then foresee suburbs being as far as they are being today?
There's no question. Land development was expanding because people wanted to have home ownership, and that was being made easier by the federal government through CMHC. And land development industry really began to flex its muscles and work hard.
So CMHC was there back then?
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. They allowed what were known as NHA, National Housing Act, mortgages, and that allowed people of modest means to own houses for the very first time. So it was a great feeling for lots of people. What I'm trying to say to you in response to your question is that we thought with that new nirvana that was coming our way, there were problems that we were creating, and we needed to correct them as soon as we could. That had to do with making sure that we were going to protect neighborhoods and not hollow out the downtown. So we were looking to have a new downtown plan with mixed use where people could live close to where they worked. We were looking for ways in which we were going to curtail the automobile so that we could make it a livable place and not just a place for cars, and that became the issue of the Spadina Expressway. They wanted 3 expressways into the core. The Spadina Expressway, the Crosstown Expressway,
We're going to talk
and
about
the Scarborough Expressway
in just a few minutes.
And none of them, of course, are now built.
Right.
Had they been built, you would have had a very different city.
Toronto. I wanted to read something from an article in the Toronto Star from Katie Dobbs, and she writes, many townships struggle to keep pace with expensive infrastructure needs like sewage and water. The region was a hodgepodge of arterial road that didn't connect, and 11 different police forces operated on 11 different frequencies. Toronto had infrastructure, access to the lake, and a healthy commercial and industrial tax base. In a 1949 report, the Toronto and York Planning Board recommended amalgamation. The province, through the Ontario Municipal Board, rejected amalgamation in 1953 and decided to form Metro Toronto, a level of government that would take on large infrastructure projects, pumping stations, expressways, parks, while leaving local governments to local matters. Amalgamation happened later, 1998, under the premiership of Mike Harris. But many of your viewers wouldn't remember Metro Hall. Did the 2 levels of government work well together?
Yeah, it was unique in North America. And you're right, in 1949, there had been 12, let me back up a little bit. All of these things have a history to them. And if you understand the history, they're easier to understand. Someone once said, history occurs every day, whether you're paying attention or not.
I love that.
Okay, for a long time, Toronto grew right up through until mid-1920s. It grew by amalgamation. So Parkdale was amalgamated by local vote. The annex, it's called the annex because it was annexed to Toronto by vote. That happened right through until 1912, 1914.
So the original Toronto was very small.
And it expanded. Like all other cities, it grew and grew and grew. But then Toronto decided that they were not going to accept any more. North Toronto and West Toronto were the last two, I think, that were added in just before the First World War. So what happened is that as the place began to continue to expand in the 20s and 30s, and then even into the 40s, early 40s, all of a sudden people said, well, what we needed services. So they created other little wee municipalities. Swansea became a municipality. East York became a municipality. Some of them had been municipalities. Others were created. The 3 lakeshore municipalities. In short, there were 12 municipalities around Toronto.
Did that work better than what we have now?
Well, it worked. It worked for its time. Okay. But by the time you get to after the war, with more and more people coming, with a new generation of the boomers on their hands, as well as immigration, we had to find some more coherent way to deal with the infrastructure questions, hard services, and questions of schools and so on and so forth. So there was a recommended in 1949 that there be some kind of amalgamation like we'd done before. But people were getting used to the municipalities that they're in. So the province of the day had a series of hearings. It went to the Ontario Municipal Board, and it had a series of hearings. And the government said, no, we're not going to have amalgamation, which the City of Toronto favored at that time. The intermunicipalities, Leaside, Weston, all of those, East York, all of those, they favored didn't want to do a lot because they were in a sense feeding off the energy of the city. The outer suburbs, Scarborough, North York, and Etobicoke, they wanted what they called contracts for services. They really needed hard services. They needed waste management, they needed roads, they needed sewers, those kind of hard services. The Frost government of the day, Frost was the premier, said in 1953, no, you're not going to have amalgamation. You're going to have a thing called Metro. And Metropolitan Toronto will have 12 constituent parts. Toronto and the suburban areas, right? Those suburban municipalities. And that became Metropolitan Toronto for the next 40 years. And it was right up until the Harris government changed it. And it was a very useful mechanism. In fact, in those days, if you were interested in these matters, people from around North America came to Toronto because they tried to have a metropolitan form of government in many other places, and Toronto was unique. And it allowed the centre to pay attention to what it thought its needs were, and it allowed the suburbs to pay attention to their needs. Now, there were lots of clashes, lots of fights, lots of politics, all of that. But in many ways, the metro system was not only unique, it was very, very useful.
I mean, the clashes haven't stopped.
No,
one of the
absolutely.
clashes, like if you live in Scarborough, we've been having this conversation about a subway stop in Scarborough, and it seems like it's not really happening, or it is, or it's not. You can never keep track. But how did Toronto manage to build an entire new subway system in the post-war years? Because
the subway system was actually built by the Toronto Transit Commission, the TTC. The TTC had been a public transportation entity since 1921, and it had run really well, right? So by the time it got to the beginning of the end of the war, they began to plan subways. They actually began to plan them, and they were in a sense on their own. They were an entity on their own. They were part of the government, but they were not financed by the government in any significant way, and so it had already an ability to begin subway building out of its own financing. It also needed some support from the provincial government. So it began planning for subways by the end of the war. And they finally built the first one in 1954. No. I know because I went down with my girlfriend, who became my wife. We skipped school to go down on the first ride.
Oh, you were dating from high school, right?
Yeah. We went down to Eglinton, from Eglinton Station down to Union Station. That was the first stretch of the subway. So that subway building began early on because people could see the value of it. It was a testimony actually to the transportation people of the day, because they were not only interested in highways and in expressways and cars, but they also understood that there needed to be strong contribution from public transit.
Well, you mentioned value because Toronto is getting bigger. We now have the GTHA, which we'll talk about in the second part of our conversation.
Okay.
But do you think that people don't see the value of having like a subway, more subways in Toronto?
Well, whether it's more subway, more LRT, more streetcar, more buses, I don't have any doubt that people want to support a good public transit system. Whether or not that must be a subway everywhere or a bus everywhere or a streetcar, I think that's kind of a zero-sum game. You should put what's appropriate for the place that you're in, and whether that's a bus or it's a streetcar or it's a subway, that's a matter, to me, of technical significance.
Well, you've been teased during your time as mayor because you did something quite controversial. You banned the construction of buildings higher than 45 feet in the downtown core. Why did you do that?
We wanted to change, as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to change the context of the downtown. We had looked at American cities where they had the expressways and the urban renewal as they understood it, and the continued separation of uses, where you work, where you play, and where you live. We wanted the downtown to be mixed use. We wanted people to live downtown as well as work there and play there. And we wanted to, therefore, to change the zoning. In those days, you couldn't change the zoning, do the planning, to do it properly, because there was no right to do so in the Planning Act. So we had to find a way to halt development for 2 years while we did the planning. That's all it was. No, people just thought it was funny because I'm a little short guy, and it was at 45 feet. He's trying to make buildings his own size, all that kind of stuff. But it was simply a holding bylaw to give us 2 years to replan the downtown. When I walk around, I live downtown now, and I walk around there and see the number of people living there and playing there as well as working there.
That was your vision of the city.
It was a testimony to what we wanted to do. It worked. For sure, it worked. And so I didn't mind being kidded about it because it had value.
Well, with more people in Toronto, more homes were being built in the post-war years. How had the idea of home ownership become so important back then?
Because people of modest means, middle-class people, didn't own. They didn't have the ability to own. In those days, if you wanted to own your place, you had to have enough money for. Usually, it was either 25% or 33% down. That was a lot.
Not the 20.
Absolutely, right? And so those are the conventional mortgages. CMHC came along and gave cheaper mortgages. And more houses were being built, so supply was up.
And that's the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation.
I'm sorry, CMHC was the Canada Mortgage and Housing. And so there was an opportunity. People were looking for their own personal nirvana. They'd been through the Depression. They'd been through the wars, and many people were hurt by those things. And what they wanted to have was equality of opportunity for themselves and their kids. So that's why education and libraries and those kinds of things became absolutely vital infrastructure, because they were the way in which the new generation that came back from the war were going to raise their families. So home ownership was a core value to them.
Well, it was also the start of the baby boom as well. How critical was the school shortage at the time?
Well, school shortage was very critical because, again, to give you some sense of it, if you took the baby boomers, in 1945, immigration was 22,000 people. Within 10 years, it was 252,000 people, immigrants, let alone the growth through the boom. So getting to plan those schools, to getting them built on time, so it's why you always had portables. They still have them around, but my generation, everybody, or at least my kids' generation, portables were everywhere.
My kids have one in Mississauga.
Okay,
yeah.
And so they used a lot. So they just tried to get as many as they built as fast as they could, and they did a really good job. Putting the value on education was a major contribution of that generation.
And was the housing boom as intense in other municipalities around Ontario?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we're talking about Toronto in many ways because it's larger. Things happened here first or early. But I can take it any city in Ontario, any reasonable sized city, and they just grew and grew and grew and grew themselves. So they had the same kinds of issues.
And we're seeing a lot of issues that we're talking about now that happened back then that are happening now.
Right.
More people are kind of being forced to move outside of Toronto and into the surrounding areas.
Right.
Did they, when the city was being built, was that forced? Like, was that something that they thought might happen?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, people wanted home ownership, and that, generally speaking, meant single-family dwelling, 50-foot lots, all of those kinds of things in the suburbs. So you were clearly going to be expanding like that horizontally. Okay, and that's now then it became more complicated for people as you moved into the 80s and 90s and new century, because now they're out in North Whitby or wherever it may have been away, and now people have commutes of an hour and a half, right? But so it's become a more of a problem. But in the early days, it was not seen as quite the problem. You were moving out to Green Acres. You were moving out to your nirvana.
Well, we're going to talk more about that, like the greater GTHA region,
Okay.
on our next conversation.
Okay.
But thank you so much for being here and giving us a history lesson of how Toronto became to be the city that so many people love and want to live here.
My pleasure.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.